አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብለው የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና ዕውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎ ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ infomedia@gmail.com ዌብሳይታችን www.adebabay.com ያግኙን ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ
በዲያስፖራ ኢትዮጵያን ባለሙያዎች የተመሰረተ በጣም ፈጣን ቀላልና ደህንነቱን የጠበቀ ዓለም አቀፍ የሞባይል ካርድ መሙያ ድርጅቱ በአሁኑ ሰዓት ከኢትዮጵያ ጋር 10 የአፍሪካ ሀገራትን ትኩረት አድርጎ እየሰራ ሲሆን በመላው ኢትዮጵያ ለወዳጅ ዘመዶቻችን የሞባይል ካርድ በቀላሉ የምንሞላበት ዘዴ ነው። ፈጣን ቶፕ አፕ አደባባይ ሚዲያን እንኳን ለአንደኛ ዓመት በዓላችሁ አደረሳችሁ ያለ ስራችንን ለመደገፍ በአደባባይ ሚዲያ በኩል ሞባይል ካርድ ለሚሞላ ከሽያጩ 7% ለአደባባይ ስራ መደገፊያ እንዲውል ያደርጋል። ለዚህም አደባባይ ሚዲያ የራሱን ማስፈንጠሪያ ተሰጥቶታል። www.fettantopUp.com/#አደባባይ በሚለው ለቤተሰብና ጓደኛ ካርድ ሲሞሉ አደባባይ ሚዲያን እየደገፉ ነው። እስከ የካቲት 21 ቀን የሚቆየውን የኢትዮ ቴሌኮም 50% ልዩ ጭማሪም ተጠቃሚ ሆናሉ። ለምሳሌ ለወዳጆ የ200 ብር ካርድ ሲሞሉ ወዳጆ 300 ብር ሆኖ ይሞላላቸዋል። የአደባባይ ሚዲያ ፈጣን ቶፕ አፕ ማስፈንጠሪያን በመጠቀም ሀገር ቤት ላሉ ወዳጅ ዘመዶቹ ካርድ ሲሞሉ አደባባይ ሚዲያን እየደገፉ ስለሆነ እናመሰግናለን። ፈጣን ቶፕ አፕ አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
Welcome everyone and thank you for joining us from around the world. This is Adebabay Media's Viewer Digest program. My name is EOTC and I will be your host for today. This month is Black History Month and a time for us to reflect on our past and draw wisdom from it as well. And one of the most recognizable quotes in pop culture is Bob Marley's "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind." One of the ways to achieve this mental freedom is to find knowledges we have forgotten about, remember who we are as people, and live true to that identity. Today, we'll be talking about an African moral philosophy and how we can integrate that into our day-to-day life. I ask that you share this conversation with us, with your audience, with your friends and family as well, and we'll be right back.
አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብለው የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና ዕውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎ ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ infomedia@gmail.com ዌብሳይታችን www.adebabay.com ያግኙን ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ
አደባባይ ሚዲያ የኔ ነው። አደባባይ ሚዲያ የኔም ነው። አደባባይ ሚዲያ የኔ ነው። አደባባይ ሚዲያ የሁላችንም ነው። የኛ ቤተሰብ አደባባይ ሚዲያን ይመለከታል። የናንተስ? Do your parents watch አደባባይ ሚዲያ? Watch, follow, subscribe and help አደባባይ። አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ።
Welcome back, everyone. Today, our guest is Dr. Teodros Kiros. Especially in recent months, we have witnessed unrest in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Sudan, Congo, recently Somalia, and of course, Ethiopia as well. And sometimes we feel helpless and solutions seem to be out of our reach. But do you sometimes wonder if we don't have all the pieces that we need to build a prosperous nation? How do we find those pieces? And many thought leaders have said that one of the ways for us to achieve this is by finding indigenous knowledges that we have forgotten about. So today with our guest, Dr. Teodros, we'll be talking about one of Africa's philosophy that we had maybe forgotten about from Egypt called math. And we'll see if we could draw some lessons from it and how we can integrate that into our day-to-day life. Welcome, Dr. Teodros, and thank you for being here with us again.
Of course, it's a great pleasure. What an honor to be able to come to one of my favorite media powerhouses,
Awesome.
media, and interact with my two brilliant sisters, named Adebabay and the great technician, Salamoid, who in the background is giving us a visually prominent presentation of our human selves.
Absolutely.
So today, then, what I thought I should do, with your guidance, the questions that you sent me are quite intense, quite penetrating, well developed, and going to generate, I hope, with the transcendent help, relevant information that we can share with the rest of the world. My intention today is to focus on Egypt. By way of exemplifying what can happen very ordinarily in the world in which we live today, namely the contributions of philosophy from the global south, this time to the global north. As you know, the historical stress linked to slavery and to cultural colonizations, what we are appropriately called exhibition of mental slavery, is that everything that is valuable, everything that is useful, invariably is linked with Western names, the names that come to mind, Plato, Aristotle, the usual giants, and then in the 19th, in the 17th, 19th century, the social contract tradition of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Today, what I'm going to do, with your permission, by way of allowing me to be somewhat loquacious, yes, so that I can put the idea of math in a proper context, is to speak about the Great Egypt. Now, the Senegalese physicist, philosopher, historian, Cheikh Anta Diop, had made two central contributions that yet have to be challenged. They are the following. One, what we call humanity today originated about 3.5 million years ago in the part of the world that we appropriately call Ethiopia, through the emergence of our first human ancestor, whose name, unfortunately, in English is Lucy, a name that was given to her by the Beatles, I think, when they were digging the remains, and then they were playing the famous song, The Beatles, and they gave Lucy that name. In our parlance, in our language, of course, she is appropriately both Dinkanesh in Amharic and Dinkawit in Tigrinya, and much else. And so that is the first historical register that Diop gently and lovingly imposed in the world, namely that we call humanity, the ancestors of which are you and me, and the Europeans, the Asians, and others, came out really of a place in which nature struck once, because nature does not strike at several places. It struck once only, and it struck a part of the world that is close to the tropics. Therefore, the color of the first humans, I believe, including Lucy herself, by definition, must have been somewhat dark. So the closer to the tropics, the desperate need for melanin, and the melanin itself, of course, gives us the textures and the colors that we have now. That's one fact. The second one, it is once again in Egypt that Diop contended we dug out 6 species the remains of which are 6 fossils, 3 of which remained in Africa, and 3 of which migrated outside of Africa. One of the migrants is the famous Garibaldi man, which gave rise to the birth of the Cro-Magnon man, whom we associate as white, who migrated from Africa to Europe through the Isthmus Canal, through the Strait of Gibraltar, first to Spain, to France, Europe, and then Asia, and became respectively a Cro-Magnon man by way of exhibiting his whiteness, and also the yellow man by way of exhibiting his Asianness and his yellowness. These are 2 fundamental facts that emerge out of the Great Egypt. Now, let me now localize and situate Maat in this discussion.
So before we do that, if you could tell us a bit about why Maat is important. I think there was a link that you made for us last time you were here about thinking about philosophy from the heart instead of from the mind. And the way Egyptians thought about philosophy was also starting from the place of the heart. So if you could tell us about that a little bit, and how then we could understand what Maat is from that perspective.
Exactly. Now, if you can give me just 2 more minutes before I directly answer that. Let me speak briefly about the Egyptian cosmology. That Egyptians hypothesized about the origin of the universe, and they grounded it in what they called Nun, N-U-N, which is water-like but not exactly water, out of which emerged the first Egyptian god, the god of the sun, by the name of Atum-Ra. And Atum-Ra himself, without a female companion, gives birth to a god and a goddesses, or created rather, and gave birth to Shu and Neftut. And then Shu and Neftut in turn gave birth to Geb and Nut. And then Geb and Nut in turn gave birth to Ma'at herself, who is identified as a wearer of an ostrich feather, and this ostrich feather was then eventually used as a scale with which the pharaohs of Egypt, the leaders themselves, upon death, their hearts would be taken out, and then they would be measured on the scale of Ma'at. And if they pass the test, namely the 42 rules that I'm not at liberty to enumerate, that the human being must follow, very much like the 10 Commandments for the Christian tradition, then that particular heart is singled out as light, as virtuous, as wise, which then qualifies for a proper mummification. Maat then is this Egyptian goddess who wore this ostrich feather, who was used in ancient Egypt as a symbol of a woman who embodies in her being, in herself, truth, generosity, kindness, empathy, and much more fundamentally, justice. Because of which the Egyptians then began comparing and contrasting the value of the human organs. And they chose the human heart in contrast to the brain, which, as I said in my earlier discussion, was literally chewed out, thrown out as a useless organ, versus the heart, which for these Egyptians was the scale of measured against the scale of Ma'at, which was a symbol of truth, justice, empathy, and compassion, and much more importantly, for them it was also the set of thinking. That's what we call the thinking, which is a combination of the passion and calculation when it is necessary is not the activity of the brain, because the brain merely processes thoughts that originate them elsewhere, but the actual thinking, the actual insights, the actual wisdom, which are mediated through truth, generosity, justice, empathy, and compassion, are the activities of the human heart. And it is only when the human being is in touch with this heart, consoles one's own heart, that what comes out in the form of choices and activities that the individual human being makes is wise, precisely because the heart itself is the source of wisdom.
So is it fair to say that math is a way ancient Egyptians organized their government and their day-to-day life?
Both. I appreciate that that question at the matter of fact. Let me be a little bit detailed and make some distinctions between the pharaohs, who are the leaders, and the ordinary Egyptians. It is not very clear in the literature whether the ideal of Ma'at is also a demand that is made from and by ordinary human beings. Although I think it is. We can develop this further. Rather, the ancient Egyptians wanted to produce leaders. This is extremely important. Who are not God. They can't possibly be God, but godlike, by which they meant their hearts. Remember, the ones that are chosen for mummification were chosen on the grounds that they exemplify lightness, depth, wisdom. And consequently, the leaders who are chosen in the form of pharaohs to govern in ancient Egypt were chosen on the grounds of the likeness of Ma'at. The question that the Egyptians asked is, how well have our leaders internalized the challenge of Ma'at? Namely, how well have these leaders, philosophers or otherwise, maintained a relationship with the practice of these 42 virtues that they must necessarily follow, and some of which declare that the human should not steal, the human should not murder, the human should not lie, the human should not be jealous, the human should not be envious, and 37 others. If the leader has taken it upon himself or herself, ancient Egypt was sex neutral, and internalized this challenge, practice them in the everyday in their everyday lives. These leaders then have become proximally and for the most part not gods but godlike.
Absolutely. I can imagine why that would be so, because these are, hard lessons for us to practice and to get used to, especially when we're talking about, compassion and generosity and being able to practice those things every day. Of course, that's as close as we could get to being as God, right? So then how did Matt see the self, the individual, or the ego as?
Okay. Now, if you internalize the challenge of Maat and Plato, who had spent quite a bit of time in Egypt, learned this from the Egyptians, and he proposes two things. One, that all human beings without exception should be aware that they have material bodies and non-material souls. The material bodies are detectable. You can observe them. You can see them. Our bodies age. We live and die. Souls, by definition, are undetectable, unobservable, not even sub-microscopically, but they are there. And in that, the person who knows there is a distinction between the material body and then the non-material soul must make, Plato advocates, sincere effort to guide the body. Because the body is naturally inclined towards violating, for example, justice, compassion, generosity, naturally, because it's much easier for the body to be kinder to itself than it would be kinder to others, for example. But once the self is aware that this self is not entirely dependent on the body, that is prone and inclined to be selfish and greedy, but is aware that he or she has a soul, then that self will have to consult the undetectable soul that is always there to help it to make the right decisions and control greed, selfishness, narcissism of all kinds, precisely because the self wants to preserve the purity of the soul, so that the soul, Plato argued following the Egyptians, which is planted in the human heart, could qualify as it transitions to the other place to go to the right place, because it has done the work here. So the possibility of all human beings, A, acknowledging that they are partly bodily, material, and partly non-bodily, and B, that it doesn't matter how difficult it is to control greed, cruelty, narcissism of all kinds. Once the self is aware that there is the soul that can help it to regulate the excesses of the body, then that human being has made now the right life path. It begins then to practice this internal civil war that is taking place inside it, between the body that is refusing to listen to reason, to listen to rationality, to guidance by the soul, and the self that knows, oh yes, my body is inclining me to do what I should not be doing. But I have a soul, and in that, when I cave in, when I consult my soul, then this raging civil war inside me that inclines me to be cruel to others, unkind to others, mercilessly uncompassionate, says to itself, I shouldn't be doing this, because the soul that I have and its reasoning power that can help me to regulate my behavior, to control my behavior, so that I could be the best that I could be. What we call then mental emancipation, for example, sometimes takes the form of emancipating ourselves from the pressures of the body that takes us to places where we should not be going, that forces us to put in things inside us that we shouldn't be doing, to accumulate wealth, income, and property that is so unreasonable that we don't exactly need it. Once we know that there is this natural civil war, literally civil war, that is taking place inside us, then all that we have to do is acknowledge the existence of the forces that are inclining us to enter into this civil war, and then use reason, which is the attribute of the soul, which is the attribute of Ma'at, embodied in compassion, empathy, generosity, and kindness, and regulate our behavior such that without even being told, it begins to become natural to us to be nice to one another, although we don't have to be. And occasionally, because the body is such that it inclines us toward being unnice, but because we're practicing this project of putting an end to this internal civil war, then Ma'at, in the form of reason, in the specific forms of compassion, generosity, and kindness, helps us to be the best that we could be, proximally for the most part. Always. In this sense, to return to your earlier question, without knowing it, not only leaders, but also ordinary human beings like you and me begin to be godlike. So the Christian argument that human beings were born after the image of God in this particular context becomes a lifelong practice. Not that we'll ever become God, but given this image of what God is that we have, then we human beings attempt to live our lives as if we can be gods. So the possibility of perfection then begins with this understanding that although we'll never be God, but since we're born in the image of God, and we make the appropriate, exceedingly difficult efforts, without knowing it, we become godlike.
So you give an example of, you know, how they're attempting to live, right, and to follow the principles of math. But then also you give an example of how during famine and disaster times, this kind of all falls apart. So could you tell us why that would be if someone is practicing, you know, the principle of math, and if that's part of what the society is trying to achieve, what makes it fall apart when in time of despair? Because if it seems like the reason why we want to practice the principles of math is so that we could be better people during, you know, during despair, when we're faced with issues that we're facing right now. For example, looking at you know, what people killing each other for their faith and for who they are and for the color of their skin, and looking at Black Lives Matter right now. If that is the standard of practice, and if that is what Egyptians have been practicing, ancient Egyptians, why does they themselves struggle with coming out of it during famine, as you're giving an example of?
Yes. That is a remarkable question. Let me give a stab at it. That's what I think, what I meant in the article that you read, which you read very carefully. The classical Egypt gave us a remarkably powerful moral vision of our possibilities, embodied in the existence of this female goddess, namely Ma'at, otherwise Shu, that ostrich feather wearing human being, who in turn gave us ideals and possibilities that we can follow under suitably excellent conditions that help us to put an end to this raging civil war. Sadly, this is my hypothesis, Egypt did not have an appropriate economic system that could correspond to these great ideals and challenges that Ma'at was giving us. There was an absence of a political economy, an economy by which we can equitably produce the resources governed by the principles of Ma'at. Then, in turn, made it possible for human beings who are making sincere efforts to approximately and for the best part be godlike, not to have a supportive economic system that could control the tendency, if not all, of some human beings who are going to take more than others, who are going to develop very sophisticated techniques of exploiting certain kinds of human beings. Let's say, for example, the human beings who spent an inordinate amount of time and labor power in the production of the pyramids by taking more than they need, which then in turn gives rise to a slavocracy, a way of arranging the economy that justified the existence of certain kinds of human beings called slaves to do the hard labor. There is a contradiction between the ideals of Ma'at, which logically, by definition, should treat all human beings, and the fact that there were certain kinds of human beings. Of course, the Egyptians did not exactly call them slaves, that we don't account for, who are laboring away from dusk to dawn and not necessarily being treated well by life, since it is the privileged pharaohs who are opulent, extremely rich, so rich that it became possible for the first time in human history for philosophy to emerge out of opulence, because the Egyptian priests had a time in their hands to look at the skies, to reflect on their existences, and to systematically develop what we called philosophy, which very much like the origin of human beings, originated in Egypt for the first time, because it's an activity that requires leisure, a good place in which to sit and look and gaze at the stars at night and ask the question, how well am I practicing the 42 challenge of man, which those who are laboring away from dusk to dawn cannot possibly do. So there is a contradiction between the ethical challenge of man that demands both of leaders and also of citizens to be the best that they could be, and the accidental, but crucially accidental fact that there were certain kinds of human beings whose life was such that they labored from dusk to dawn without necessarily being adequately compensated by the math that their leaders have internalized.
So
ancient Egypt had the right moral economy, the right morality, but not the right political economy. Whereas I argue our own time, our capitalist societies might conceivably have efficient ways of distributing resources, but we do not have the kinds of brilliant principles that are embodied in math that Egypt had.
Yeah. Okay, so that now we've set up the ground for what math is and how it was practiced in Egypt, in ancient Egypt. Could you tell us if there's any difference between who were the ancient Egyptians and are they the same inhabitants of Egypt right now?
I appreciate the question. Here I'll draw heavily, and I'll have to be a bit talkative if you allow me without dominating the conversation, because that's not my intention from Sheikh Antadiya. Remember the reference that I made to these two foundational facts that Diab imposed on the thinking world. One, that humanity originated about 3.5 million years ago in Ethiopia. The second point is crucial. The first human beings who appeared on Earth, according to Diab, within the proximity to the tropics, were by definition black. Why were they by definition black? He argued because of the proximity to the sun. That is Diab's elegant argument. We can explain the emergence of the idea of race, not racisms. That's very different. The idea of race. Two, the geographical grounding of the emergence of the first 6 species in a part of the world that was closer to the equator and necessarily darkened the human color. So for him, race is not a biologically detectable composite of genes and other matters. For him, no, it is a consequence of a color that the human being begins to wear as a result of a continuous exposure to the sun, which then cannot help but give us human beings who are black. By black meaning dark-skinned. And the color of the self then begins to change, as I indicated earlier, as 3 fossils left Africa. The other 3 remained in Africa, meaning they maintained their blackness across the continent. Whereas the 3 adventurous ones that left begin to adapt the climatic habitats of the places to which they went. And in this instance, it's essentially Europe and Asia, and gave rise to human beings who look yellow and human beings who look, for lack of a better term, white. Note then how yellowness and whiteness came into being. They are consequences of migrations. But were it not for these migrations they have contend, the world would also be a desert. So it is as if the Creator decided to develop destinies for human beings. A destiny for those who do not have to leave, who decided to remain behind, and a destiny for those who chose to leave, and then began changing, inhabiting the world, and gave us diversifications only of the color of the original self, the original member of the human race, which by definition is singularly one, and it was originally black. To answer your question then, yes, the ancient citizens of Egypt were black.
Okay, thank you.
This is Diop's thesis, which I think is quite convincing, but it has been challenged, and it continues to be challenged. There are those who think that nature did not necessarily strike once only, that it's at different parts of the world giving rise to yellows, whites, and blacks. Diop would not relent, because for him, nature, scientifically speaking, strikes only once, and it struck at that part of the world which is the closest to the tropics, and gave us dark-skinned human beings for the first time, the ancestors of humankind. This, of course, would blow the minds of supremacists, as you can imagine. But if they are to think intelligently and scientifically, they will have to humbly submit to Diop's logical argument. He was a physicist with tremendous mastery of experimentations in the lab with pigmentations, with melanin for years, worked from Dakar in Senegal. Yeah. And he is very careful to point out, from the fact that human beings originated in Africa, it doesn't necessarily follow, nor should it follow at all, that blacks are superior. The notions of superiority and inferiority are not consequences of the emergence of the human being at a particular part of the world. It's merely a report of a fact. The value judgments of whiteness and blackness, yellowness, superiority and inferiority are not attributes of the argument of the origin of human beings. To say that human beings originated in Africa is to simply say that that is where they came from. Yep. We do not have to valorize them, but just like I did not necessarily create and ask God to make me Teodros, nor did you ask God to make you Heward, and whatever people think we look like. We just found out one day that you are a female, I'm a male, I have a name, you have a name, I'm an Ethiopian, you are an Ethiopian, and so on and so forth. These are accidental attributes of the growth of human beings, but it doesn't have anything to do with the idea of origin. The idea of origin is an objective report of where we came from.
Absolutely. For those of you that are just joining us, in light of Black History Month, we're talking about an African philosophy that talks about, our moral identity and how we can build that in way of Egypt. If you're just joining us, welcome, and we'll be right back after a quick break.
Adebabay Media ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምብኝ ብለው የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና ዕውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎ ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን adebabayinfomedia@gmail.com ዌብሳይታችን www.adebabay.com ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ
Welcome back, everyone. And we're having a conversation with Dr. Teodros today about a moral principle that is called Ma'at from Egypt. So, Professor, I'll read a quick quote from your paper that I found quite interesting. So, it is Egyptian insight about the heart at the seat as the seat of thinking, particularly moral thinking that gives the heart a central place for moral economy. So what do you mean by moral economy?
Okay. What I mean by moral economy is the following. Suppose, as a human being, that you are, by the accidents of history, born to a family that is materially prosperous, whose needs are fully and completely met, whose members do not have to wake up every day thinking whether or not they will have bread and food on the table because there is so much of it at home. But then in the neighborhood, as you walk around sometimes or drive by, you notice that there are human beings whose children you always see are roaming the streets of your neighborhood. Occasionally, when you are driving by in your fancy BMW, particularly in the context of poor nations such as our own Ethiopia, 10, 15 children whose ages range from 1 to 10 stretch their hands directly to your car, hoping that you will throw anything at them. Well, you are the type, not necessarily only on that day, but on many, many other days before that, who think that they're rudely interrupting your leisurely life. You're even upset that you're touching your car. Because from the fact that they're poor, it's sometimes determined that they are necessarily dirty, unbathed, unshowered. And what is even more, their smell irritates you. It's 10, 15 hands that are rudely entering your car and literally saying to you, gosh, please give me anything. I haven't eaten for days. And then you're looking at the traffic light and anxiously waiting for it to turn red. And then without paying a single attention, you whisk by, you disappear. And these 10 kids are as poor as they always were, because their needs were not even attended to. Now, there is a question that we have to address here. The question is, how is it possible for this human being, who is only by the accidents of birth and by the accidents of history born to a family that can afford a good place, a good car, a good job, and yet there are these human beings, and what is even more, their children, who seem to be desperate, so desperate that they're risking their lives and putting their hands inside your car and begging for crumbs, and yet you have not been moved by anything. Correct me if I'm wrong, Hewitt. Don't you think that human being is suffering from the absence of having a moral sensibility that should have readily and naturally made it possible for him or her to literally stop what she or he is doing and attend to these human beings?
Yeah.
Generalize this as a universal practice, you would. of what human beings do every day, every single day. There is a lacking, an absence of a connection between your humanity and the humanity of the other. You have become alienated from yourself and forgetting completely that those whom you almost killed once the traffic light was on and you had to run to a meeting, an expensive meeting in which you're going to throw $100 for lunch when 10 children, human beings like you, have just been unattended to and neglected by you. It is when the self is so disorganized, morally disorganized, that I want to contend that there is an absence of moral economy inside that self. What I called earlier this civil war that is raging between what you must do by virtue of the fact that you're a human being, a reflective, a thoughtful human being, and what you're miserably failing to do. Not necessarily because you can't. I'm convinced that you can. But you have decided as if you shouldn't. I'm convinced that you have made that kind of decision. Because you could have also decided to say, what is wrong with me? I once heard of a report in Ethiopia about 15 years ago of a woman who was carrying coins in her car and would arrive at a particular place by Bole in Addis. And children will spot her arrival at that particular time because they know that there is a human being whose moral economy is vigilant and who has thought through what she must do every day, which is to think about how many coins she has in that car, because she has imposed on herself a duty that says those children who are accustomed to come to you every day will be there. And in that, you must make absolutely sure that you have what they need so that they can be attended to, so that they can be taken care of. Such a human being, I want to contend, has a moral power inside her. Such a human being has now become moral. Moral economy, then, is the possibility of dreaming, as I did when I was 28 years old and wrote a book called Moral Philosophy and Development, The Human Condition in Africa, in which I dreamt about the possibility of cultivating human beings whose relationships among themselves and between themselves will be guided by these moral principles. The concept of ma'at, then, if you like, is precisely what ordinary individuals could make their own. So that compassion, generosity, empathy, kindness, and justice just become natural to them. As natural as wearing a shirt in the morning, because one must before one leaves the house. So I can imagine the possibility of a human being waking up every day here, every single day, and reminding himself or herself, who am I going to be kind to today? Whom am I going to treat justly today? Whom am I going to have a compassionate attitude towards today? And whom I may fail to be sufficiently compassionate, empathetic, just, and generous, not because I don't want to, but because I haven't internalized the challenge of man, the principles of morality, that I haven't cultivated a moral economy inside me. If we were to cultivate human beings who develop this moral economy in themselves, then the consequence would be a society that has a universalizable moral economy that is going to result in the treatment of human beings the way it should be, with a measure of compassion, a measure of justice, a measure of generosity, and a measure of kindness, unfailingly as a self-imposed moral duty.
Our viewers are asking for you to speak a bit louder because I think they're having a hard time hearing you. But then when we're talking about moral economy, is that something that is applicable to the individual, or is that something that we could, you know, maybe think about creating it in an institutional level?
Excellent. Now, you always ask excellent questions. If the possibility of moral economy is to work and work for all human beings, it is not enough for individuals to make isolated moral decisions when they leave home in the morning, to practice compassion, justice, generosity, and kindness. In addition, because human beings are flawed, as we learned from the Yacob, because human beings are forgetful, because human beings are imperfect, because human beings as bodily beings are sometimes selfish, greedy, and self-regarding, the possibility of the good moral life could become lasting, and lasting only if we also create institutions that are inhabited by human beings who in an isolated way are doing the work, but that we have to institutionalize what human beings are struggling to do and be the best that they could be, so that it could be replicated by institutions and, when necessary, embody it in a constitution that is directly written by the people themselves. And so that long after we are gone, after a particular generation is gone, then moral principles and the moral life has now become a national habit that all institutions and constitutions are aware of, that future generations could build on. So that we need both individuals who, in their own way, are going to develop appropriate moral measures, appropriate moral economies, by making them part and parcel of the fabric of the self, but also as people who work, as people who live within families, and so on. They should also build and cultivate institutions that are going to help them in a regular way to continue being the best that they are attempting to be as human beings, so that we can help them to deal with the possibilities of flaws and imperfections.
Yeah. Honestly, like, that sounds really, really great, right? In principle, I would love, and I think everybody would love to have that kind of an economy system or forum for us that allows us to practice, that the generosity and compassion and tolerance that you're talking about. But I think for me, I'm having a bit of a hard time envisioning, for example, if we think about, let's pick generosity, how does that look like in an institution sense of things? Because right now, when I think about generosity, I can only think about it as, individuals, sharing what they have, or corporations making donations. How would that look like outside of the donation kind of realm?
Okay. Here, I think what we need to do in a very objective way is learn from one of the greatest, if not the greatest thinkers of the 19th century, namely Karl Marx, whom we don't pay sufficient attention to because the global media has distorted his vision of the good society into a few oppressive phrases here and there, and throwing terms such as communism and socialism to others. But if we were to read Marx very, very carefully, what Marx does in all his works, not necessarily only in Das Kapital, which is his most powerful work of economics, but also much earlier than that in his philosophical work, which is called the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, in which he develops 5 forms of alienation: the alienation of the human being from oneself, the alienation of the human being from others, the alienation of the human being from what he produces, the alienation of of the self from the human beings with whom he produces, and finally the alienation of the self from the world as part and parcel of the human species. And then in the end, he challenges us not to leave matters only to individual acts of generosity, but to create a form of society that is going to make it impossible for human beings to be subject to exploitation at the workplace. By which he means, as you know, let's say there is this individual, such as you or me, works at a particular place, say from 8 to 9, produces, works extremely hard. And then at the end of the day, that individual is given wages that hardly measure the amount of labor, the amount of work, the amount of sweat, the amount of toil that this particular laborer has invested when he or she is serving coffee at Starbucks. Because at the end of the day, the individual goes home with a wage system that doesn't really measure what he has produced for the owners at Starbucks. Marx called this exploitation. And then Marx would continue further. It may not be enough for corporations that are unjustly and unnaturally exploiting human beings by paying them wages that do not measure the values that they have created, the surplus values that they have created, which becomes the necessary and sufficient condition for the production of profit for the owners of the means of production. And then individuals are expected to appeal to corporations for corporations to be charitable towards the workers. When the situation is such that the corporations are not really justified, nor should they be expected to be generous toward the laborers, because it is the laborers who have created the values that have created the corporations to begin with. So Marx advises workers around the world to rise, march, and put an end to this system of exploitation, so that workers do not have to be at the gates and on the mercies and the charities of corporations. Instead, Marx envisioned the possibility of creating, for lack of a better term, a society that is governed by what I'm attempting to call moral economy. A moral economy that, by definition, makes it impossible for human beings to even think in terms of exploiting anybody. Because to exploit the other is to exploit yourself. And in that, the moral economy that you have internalized inside you, by definition, across a long stretch of time and through practices, has made you a moral being who is not even going to think in terms of exploiting any other human being. It is this reality, this hidden reality, that Karl Marx unmasked, because of which he becomes the enemy of corporations. Because not at the connections between what corporations must do by a system of profit extraction to make themselves rich, and then become places to which we go to and appeal for a generous interaction with them. When the fact of the matter is that if we were to change the system of producing resources and make it possible for human beings to own what they produce, then oneself does not have to be unnecessarily generous towards the other.
But then how's that different from taking away stuff from somebody else, right? Because yes, these corporations are rich, but it's still their stuff, and it's still they're providing the work that people need to be able to pay the bills that they can, right? I think when we're talking about exploitation, there's always that mark of what kind of labor are you providing? Is it skilled labor or is it unskilled labor? And it's always difficult to negotiate when you are talking about unskilled labor as far as how much you could get paid and how much you can make and how much you're worth. But then if we start talking about, you know, those laborers that are working for a company to start owning what they are producing. In effect, we're saying those corporations shouldn't exist because they should be owned by the individuals that are employed by these corporations. So don't we get to that point where we all want a piece of the cake, but no one is around to bake the cake?
Okay. Would you consider, Heward, I love the challenge, the possibility of collectively owning the products that are produced by a corporation, collectively owning them. Not that one individual owns owns one thing and one thing only, but that whatever that corporation produces could be shared among the shareholders through a system of cooperatives.
So are we still talking about going into a company to get a piece of that share? Or are we talking about creating a company where we all own a piece of it? Because I think for me, I'm always, yes, there's that sense of like rich people and the corporations and all that stuff we can talk about, but they are an entity that stood on their own and they do produce a lot of wealth to the communities that are around. Maybe not to the extent that we like it to, but when we're talking about going in there and saying, okay, we deserve this piece of cooperation that you all worked hard for because we work here now.
Well, I think I envision the possibility of allowing, for lack of a better term, individually owned small businesses, for example.
Okay.
I do allow that. But that need not necessarily be at loggerheads with the possibility of, at the same time, creating corporations, to use their term, which could at least be governed by a system of cooperation by these individuals and who have internalized what I have called this moral economy inside them, and for whom it would never occur, even if they could, exploiting their fellow workers. Instead, they would use their skills, their passions, and their God-given talents for the collective enrichment of the corporation. So that at the end of the day, individuals who work within these corporations would not go home as envious and jealous, as angry, but as fulfilled. In fact, they might even try harder to produce wealth, because this is a wealth that is going to be collectively owned. But at the same time, we should also allow individuals who may have exceptional skills that justifies that for all kinds of psychological reasons would like to have their own small businesses. Will allow them to flourish also. What Marx was condemning, I think, in absolute terms, is this unjustified exploitation that is taking place at the point of production and resulting in a system of wages that do not do justice and measure to the amount of wealth that individuals have been producing from dawn to dawn. All that you have to do, you will pay attention how hard Starbucks workers work. Hard, like machines, from machine to machine, taking our weaknesses, our cruelties, our inattentiveness to them, the way we mistreat them. We don't even know their names. From the fact that they work at Starbucks, we tend to think that they are so unskilled that They deserve not to be attended to, not to even be treated like human beings. And look at the wealth that a particular section of a Starbucks creates at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
This phenomenon has always fascinated me. There is a Starbucks by Berkeley. I am sure that particular store is serving 300, 400 Berkeley students every day. And at the end of the day, a typical Starbucks worker is going home maybe with $30 a day. Yeah. It's that kind of exploitation that Marx had the audacity to call unjust and must be ended.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we could all agree on that sense of the amount of money people are making for the amount of time that they're putting in. It's not necessarily considered just. It can't be considered just, right? If someone is working 40 hours a week, and if they still can't provide what is enough, what would be considered enough for the family, they have to go find themselves a part-time job and such. It's always tricky. But I think for me, what I always struggled with is that something, maybe like you said, it's something that we could practice individually, that moral economy, so that when we become these executives of these companies, that we have that moral responsibility to the human that we can share, so we don't feel that need to make, just the idea is not just the profit, right? The idea could be the profits and the people that work in there and the community that we belong in. And I think there are some corporations right now that are trying to include that community aspect of it. Whether or not we trust them is a different conversation, I think, to be had. But I see how that could be profitable in that sense of it. And then maybe if you could add one more concept in there for us. How does tolerance look like in a corporation? I guess, how do we integrate that, and why is that important?
That's fascinating, and a lot of my students who have read this piece, it's widely read. Always note the section on tolerance that I have developed there with great fascination in the following sense. I imagine, as you know, Hewitt, I'm also a novelist, so I'm used to inventing characters by using my imagination. So I created a character in that piece that you read in the form of this female worker. She doesn't necessarily have to be female. My choice of her as female is purely contingent, is purely accidental, nothing more, nothing less. So that won't be subject to misunderstanding. It could also just as easily be male, who has a rather peculiar work habits. She is what some people might think is sloppy. She scatters papers everywhere. She's not punctual. She doesn't dress, not that she has to, in any professionally acceptable way. It's conceivable that she just woken up and perhaps she knew that she's going to get late. So she comes to work rather according to some chauvinists. Not in a way that is attractive to them. Mm-hmm. But then when she sits behind that desk, she does wonders for the company. She's brilliant, efficient, skilled. She could produce work that might take others 10 hours in an hour or two with remarkable efficiency. But her boss is puzzled because her boss is a control freak. His office is elegant. It's clean. And he likes it clean. He also wants the setting in which this female works to be as clean as his, because in his illusory sense of self, he is the model of what a workspace should look like. This was only in the beginning. And they have fought many times. And he has been numerous times on the verge of firing her. But then, for reasons that I do not get into, because I was only publishing an article, it's very, very different. If it was a character in my novel, I've not developed it fully and completely. He changes. He's so smart that he says to himself, I have fought with her. I have threatened to fire her. I have humiliated her numerous times. She does not change, but yet the work is being done. So, if anybody should change, he says to himself, I think it should be me. It's much easier for me, perhaps, to close my eyes and not go to the space in which she works, because I don't want to look at this inelegant stuff. Perhaps I should just go and pick up the work that she has done and turn my back and go to my elegant office. After all, she has her own space and I have mine. Such a person, I contend in that piece, is beginning to internalize the moral economy of tolerance. But not only tolerance, I could have developed this further, but also respect for the way human beings work and how different our work habits are. That our work habits should not illusorily be reduced to our race, our sex, our gender, our culture, our nationalities, as we do invariably when we're stereotyping human beings everywhere, as murderers, as rapists, as thieves, as lazy, as sluggish. What have we not done to destroy human dignity? Yeah. In that piece, I asked for the possibility of developing a moral economy in the form of tolerance, which is also inextricably linked to the idea of respect that makes it possible for us to live with others without violating their dignities. As you know, this argument should also be linked to my critique of capitalism. Because capitalism does not encourage these kinds of tolerances, because we can hire and fire, you see here what? Because that element of compassion and generosity and kindness, the embodiment of ma'at, is not part of the moral economy of the corporation manager. He does not look at himself as someone who must necessarily be generous, necessarily just, necessarily kind to any other. No. His relationship with that of his workers is that they are money-producing machines. And in that, they are replaceable. He could replace and displace them. And he has no obligation to love them and respect them and care for them, because they are replaceable work machines. The moral economy that I'm asking for, informed by Karl Marx, but going beyond him, and allowing the possibility of small businesses on the one hand, and corporations on the other hand, builds upon developing human beings whom we must systematically cultivate from very, very early on by having them exposed to the piece that I have published, for example. I would love this piece to be read at kindergarten. I would love my 8-year-old son to read about this, about math, about generosity, about tolerance, about kindness towards human beings, because we live in a world in which we've been told that it is not our business to be kind and generous to others. In fact, the situation becomes despicable that we think that our neighbors are human beings that we must protect ourselves from, not human beings whom we should venture to know, because we are in them and they are in us. That we're living in a world in which there are no neighbors, strictly speaking. And if there are, I have learned from the great Christian tradition, our first commitment, our first love is to love our neighbors as deeply as we do ourselves. And I think the metaphor of neighborliness in the Judeo-Christian tradition, I think, is the love of the other, the love of any other human being. That the world is composed of human beings who are our neighbors. They are our brothers and sisters.
Yeah. I think maybe capitalism gets a bit of harsh treatment, because I feel like it does allow for the greedy to exist. But to the same degree, though, I think the main focus, at least for me, is, like you said, the ability to develop that human, the ability to develop ourselves into that compassionate, generous, tolerant beings. But I think even to get to that point, there's these two things that I keep coming back to. Is like, one, the ability to know oneself, right? And then two, the ability to be unfearful of who we are, right? Because I think sometimes we're so terrified of who we are that we try to control everything else around us. So our level of tolerance is almost equivalent to our level of tolerance to ourselves and how much we're willing to tolerate, especially when we are stuck in this prison. That you're saying that when we see every impossibility within us, every ugliness, every thing that we should be ashamed of, right? And then of course, we see that in other people as well. So I think that's where that intolerance comes from. But I don't necessarily know if it has anything to do with capitalism as a system itself. Yes, it does allow for those things to happen. But I think it's mostly really the focus is the human, how we're willing and able to develop ourselves. And that does take time.
Okay, I like your challenge. I'm not as harsh as I sound to be toward capitalism. You're quite right. I should modulate my arguments considerably. Maybe it's possible, as you would put it, to humanize capitalism, provided that, as you argued earlier, because you understood where I was going so brilliantly, that may be a matter of developing these moral sensibilities in human beings. And once we develop those sufficiently, it shouldn't in the end matter whether the economic system that these human beings are going to inhabit should necessarily be socialism or capitalism. It could be any form of an economy. My demand is that economy is moral. Hence, I have given it the name moral economy. It's meant to be an alternative both to capitalism and to socialism. In fact, I do say that in the piece that you read, I think. That's why I chose that term, moral economy, that makes it possible for me to cultivate human beings who have embodied the ethical virtues of man on the behalf of the human condition, and then develop an appropriate economic form that must necessarily correspond to these moral sensibilities. And it's conceivable that this economic form could be a radically reformed and changed capitalism with a genuine human face.
Yeah, I love that.
Accustomed to that. In fact, you just challenged me. So that I sound like a tired communist. People are going to dismiss offhand. I think you're making my argument, as a matter of fact, smoother and more attractive, so that human beings could give it the attention that I'm trying to draw to it by synthesizing the economy with a morality under the rubric of a moral economy, an economy which is sufficiently moral, and a morality that is sufficiently economically efficient. So capitalism is, in fact, globally known for its efficiency. And efficiency is a crucial virtue for the kind of moral sensibilities that I'm asking for. The more efficient the system, as a matter of fact, the more possible it would be for us to be generous, kind, just, and tolerant toward others, because there are enough goods, enough surpluses that we do not necessarily need. So it becomes easier for us under the possibility of controlling scarcity to be considerably more kind, considerably more tolerant, considerably more kind than we would otherwise be under an economic system that is simply inefficient.
Absolutely. I think also, like, I really like that idea of, you know, me having control before I assign that work to somebody else, because I think as humans we have, at least for me, something I struggle with is I always trying to make sure, like, what is my personal responsibility in this situation before I blame, you know, what is outside, right? What is a corporation doing, or what is an institution doing, is one conversation to be had. But I think there's a lot of power that we have as individuals as well to be able to change what we believe in and actually really truly practice the things that we believe in. And I think there's a lot to be said about that before we default, you know, the work to the unknown or the unseen corporation and the leaders that we don't necessarily know about.
Exactly. It's like stereotyping human beings by virtue of the fact that they are corporate managers, as if I know them. And
yes.
Your challenge is that you're only commenting on abstractions. In the absence of knowing these human beings concretely, you're being too audacious to simply label them because they are owners of the means of production, whom you think are by definition callous, indifferent, ungenerous, intolerant, unkind, so on and so forth. And in the end, what you're doing is alienating yourself from human beings who might listen to you, provided that you're sufficiently generous to them and also aware about the ambiguity of the human situation. I like that argument considerably. There's something else that your observations have encouraged me to think about. It's the following. As you know, there is a raging debate now among African-American Black conservatives about neighborhoods in which Blacks live and in which Blacks are not being kind to one another, where crime rates are very high. So some Black conservatives, so they say, are sick and tired of being told that the reason that Blacks are unkind to one another in these neighborhoods is a consequence of slavery. Now, there are those Black conservatives who are contending that, but to say that Blacks have criminal habits in their neighborhoods and in that they are not kind to one another cannot possibly imply that they do so because they have been victimized by slavery. And what is even more, they contend, this argument implies that Blacks have no agency, by which they mean what you are contending, responsibility to themselves. And in that the habits that they have cultivated might in a crucial sense be linked to slavery, in the following sense, that the neighborhoods, the hoods in which they live, are violations of their human and civil rights as a consequence of the Jim Crow laws that have been popularly practiced for hundreds of years, both in the North and the South, which result in particular decapitated, poor, and miserable neighborhoods in which some Blacks are being raised. But then the Black conservatives contend, how do you explain the fact that some Blacks who were raised in these neighborhoods managed to escape their condition, exploited devices such as affirmative action, managed to make it Harvard, to Princeton, Stanford, so forth and so on, and became superstars. Are these individuals also not products of slavery, they contend? How is it that some manage to escape their concrete conditions and others didn't? Now, the question that you asked earlier, which is linked to this idea of responsibility, I think has something to do with that. Even in miserably horrible situations, it is conceivable for human beings to make determined efforts, which in the end result as stories of success, to overcome these conditions and radically change their lives, which is what these Black conservatives are contending is what the agency of Blacks is. That capacity that they have to change their life situation, their life chances, while others don't. This question is beginning to engage me, to fascinate me.
Yeah.
Because the sense in which I attempt to be kind sometimes blinds my eyes to certain flaws that I see right in front of me. And instead of challenging human beings to attend to themselves and change their conditions, I have a tendency to misapply my kindness and excuse them.
Yeah.
The Black conservatives are contending liberals have been doing this to Blacks. And they are calling for an end to this.
Yeah.
This thing is also related to this moral economy that I'm asking for. How is this moral economy going to account for certain individuals within that moral economy who have not sufficiently cultivated their moral sensibilities and occasionally, in fact, exploited in the negative direction by not trying their best to be the best that they could be, and instead rely on liberal institutions that are going to perpetuate their helplessness and maintain these ghettos instead of challenging these human beings by their own efforts, determined efforts, not necessarily their bootstraps, to responsibly challenge life and be the best that they could be.
Yep.
What are your thoughts? Challenge.
I think for me, I'm on the conservative side, and I say that. Let me tell you one story that I had when I went to college, right? I remember the exact moment I learned that I was an oppressed human being. And that came from an education, right? So I was taking, I think, a women's studies course, and the professor took us outside and she had us line up, and it's called a privilege line. She had us line up and she said, I'll read a sentence, you know, and I'll tell you to step forward or step backward, depending on where in that category you fit in. And she said, if you're white, step forward. If you're Black, step backward. If you're a man, step forward. If you're a woman, step backward. If you're a first generation student, step backward. If you're, you know, if your parents have gone to college, step forward. And in that sense, like, I ended up in the back of the line. Right? Like, I'm first generation, English is not my first language. I'm a woman, I'm Black, you know, all those things. And for me, until that moment, I didn't even realize I had been oppressed by anything. I've never experienced that in my day-to-day life, right? So it was just strange for me to walk out of there thinking, oh, well, I'm screwed. Like, there's nowhere for me to go from here. Like, why even try, right? If everything is rigged against me, if everything is working against me, if all the institutions that I'm going to walk into, they're going to see that I'm Black and woman, by default, I don't know much, or I have to work twice as hard, 3 times as hard to even prove that I belong there, right? What's the point? Now thinking back, like, why was that necessary to teach a 19-year-old these lessons? How is that going to empower me? How is that going to help me be a better citizen? How is that going to help me overcome all these, supposed oppressions that are bestowed upon me just by the things that I was born with? So I was just like, what was the reason behind this? And the only reason I can come up with is it is the guilt that white people would feel about what has happened in the history of this country, right? And for them to get rid of that guilt is by further victimizing me into thinking I'm a lesser being and there's nothing I can do about it.
Exactly right. You nailed it. I remember this, for example. There was this liberal professor like you, whom I had when I was an undergrad. When I was just emerging to the language and learning how to write, how to think. And because English is not my first language, as it evidently is not yours. I'd make grammatical mistakes. But this professor never corrected these grammatical mistakes. Afraid, perhaps, that to do so is for him to be a racist. Only because I'm dark-skinned. Totally oblivious to the fact that in addition to the obviousness of my skin color, he's also forgetting that I'm someone who's struggling with a foreign language, and in that my blackness shouldn't have anything to do with skills that I must necessarily master. All that he needs to attend to is the fact that I haven't mastered the grammar yet. And in that, it is irrelevant whether I'm black or white. If there is a skill that has to be attended to. His profession as a professor, I could hit the ceiling, I could go to the chair, scream, rave and rave. All that he needs to have is evidences that prove that I'm simply not there, and in that until I get there, until I master the requisite skills, I must be given the decent cease to do so. To put it in the language of moral economy would be to treat me as a dignity, as a human being.
Absolutely.
But you see, liberalism has fostered this attitude that what we should expect from dark-skinned human beings, given their inherent inferiority, does not have to lead them to challenge us to be as skilled as they are. Because some of them think that skill is white also. And the absence of it is black. You see the way now whiteness and blackness are being used as exercises in irresponsibility.
And I think at the heart of that is really,
yes,
and at the heart of that is really what I would call racism. Not none of this like someone saw me and did XYZ, but like that is the definition of racism for me.
Exactly.
And this reminds me of, there's a quote that Malcolm X said, the most dangerous thing for a black person in America is a white liberal. And it really is that sense of, oh, you can't do the work, so let me do it for you. Oh, you can't do the work, it's okay, like I will make sure that you pass this class. And for me to be in college and meet black students that did not know how to read, that did not know how to do basic math, was baffling to me. How did you make it all the way to college for you not to be able to read well, for you not to be able to write full sentences and essays and such? And to make it all worse, they would go ahead and hire TAs for them to do these homeworks, right? Because they're athletes or whatever. And for me, I'm like, this is a form of racism. This is the form of slavery that we need to be fighting. Yes, Black Lives Matter has their own cause or whatever, but this is at the heart of what the issue is. Our schools are horrible, and we are set up with white liberals that think, oh, they're not able to do it, so let's just cut them slacks here and there. So they're not helping us, because that's not realistic. When we go to work, no one cares, you know, because again, like capitalism, no one cares what your skin of the color of your skin is. They're gonna care how much you're gonna be able to provide for them. And if your provision is zero, then you're back to poverty, regardless of what kind of degree you have. So I don't see how that's helpful. So I guess in that case, I'm definitely on the Black conservative end of that spectrum.
Brilliantly said. And that's exactly what happens. If these skills are not attended to, as you put it very well, they're going to haunt you. They're going to follow you to the corporation that is going to hire you. You're going to last there for exactly one day, if lucky, be fired the next day, and then you're going to shout racism.
Yeah.
When the shouting should have taken place when you were at a place in which you could challenge your professor and even say, I do not deserve this grade. I could hardly write a sentence. Please show me, teach me how to do the work. Show me how to fish. Do not fish for me. You nailed it.
Yeah. And I think we've gotten to that point also where being a victim is like acceptable, right? To say I'm a victim and advertise that makes money in a most interesting way to see it. So it's difficult for people to come out of it, because there's so many made up theories about race relations in America that if I really decide to be the victim of the system, I'll find everything I need to articulate how much of a victim I am. And I don't see how that could possibly be helpful to Black people in America.
Exactly right. And you know what else I learned from Cornell? Cornell is brilliant, a good friend of mine. Yeah. The other day, he was speaking about the way that Blacks have internalized white supremacy. Thank you. Thank you so much. Appropriate. Black crimes, Cornell contends, in fact, are manifestations of the internalization of the white supremacists. You see, the Black crimes that Blacks are committing are precisely the way that white supremacy has demonized them and projected them to the world as monsters.
Yeah.
So, when they are committing crimes against one another, it is precisely the crimes that the white supremacist would have them commit so that he could turn around and say, you see, they're destroying our communities.
Yeah.
Because there was a time in the history of this country in which immediately after the slavery was legally abolished, a series of amendments were passed, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, during which time, during a period of 10 years, Blacks began showing in the South what slaveholders never thought they could do.
Yeah.
They opened their own small businesses and ran them successfully.
Yeah.
They managed to choose 2 Black senators and 16 members of the House. They built powerful churches, which were functioning as homes for Blacks who did not have families that were destroyed by the brutalities of slavery. The Black church becomes a place to which the Black musician goes to, as Coltrane did, to practice the piano and become one of the greatest musicians ever. Now, because the neighbors were complaining when Coltrane were playing saxophone that he was too loud. So you had a Black minister who took him, opened the gate for him on Sunday afternoons and to come and practice the piano. The churches become places to which Blacks were going, to create and maintain deep communions with God, and also to look for family structures, for places where they're going to be disciplined, which is what we Ethiopians do sometimes, and do it well when we're thinking smartly. Yeah. A function that we're increasingly losing now which I will not get into.
Yeah.
But the Ethiopian church, very much like the Black church, was a school, an institution of teaching, which individuals are going to learn the virtues in the language of moral economy to develop the moral principles that I'm contending are embodied in Marx.
Yeah.
But then, when whites, the Confederate States, began realizing that if he gave blacks the opportunity to practice their agency, that they could change their life chances and they could become as good as you, they begin rolling them back.
Yeah.
Everything that was given to them was taken back. Voting rights were taken back. Due process of law, which is the 14th Amendment, was violated. It took another 10 years in the form of the civil rights struggles of the 1970s to once again empower blacks to do what they did so brilliantly during the period of Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And now, neighborhoods have become festing grounds for black crimes. Because this is what the supremacists want to see. When they saw, as they did during the period of Reconstruction, that blacks could triumph and succeed, they became terrorized.
Yeah.
Because they had convinced themselves that blacks are inferior to them. Then black Reconstruction gave them an empirical evidence that they are not. We are at a point in time now in which what was gained during the Reconstruction has become gravely destroyed. And now there is a new move. I would like you to read a book called The Black Manifesto, I think, by the columnist for the New York Times, whose name I forget, who is now advocating that blacks have to return to the South and reconstruct what they have what they have left the North,
Yeah.
with people who look like them and with people who are not going to victimize them as inferior. At the minimum, they would be living in neighborhoods with people who look like them, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in that conversation also something that surprised me when I found out was right now as we're living, the most black kids are being born outside of wedlock than ever before. Than before even slavery, and the whole purpose of slavery was to separate families. So kids were growing up with both parents during slavery than they are now. And that's when I think that conversation of personal responsibility comes in place, where we know for a fact when a child is being raised by both parents, the chances of success is very, very high in every spectrum, in everything we could possibly look at. And to have an organization like Black Lives Matter to come out and say, that the marriage is a racist mindset, to have, to ask for a father and a mother is a very Eurocentric, I think that's what they called it, a Eurocentric ideology we don't accept. For me, so do you want to continue to see the degradation of your communities? Because we know for a fact when a house is being led by a strong man, there is no way, that child is going to grow up with all the resources that you could possibly need. Maybe not, still poverty and all that, but there's going to be someone that's going to make sure that they went to school. There's going to be someone that makes sure that at night they stayed at home, right? That protection that they needed. But then to actively ask ourselves to go actively against that structure that we know works, right? We've heard Obama say this. We've heard other Black conservatives say this. But for a big organization like Black Lives Matter to come out and speak against it is, for me, a very heartbreaking thing to see, because then where do we go from here, right? When we see all the issues of Black communities, most of it being traced back to not having a father. And to require, to ask for that is a racist thing, is just, I just don't know what to say about that, because it's just like, are we going to continue to degrade our communities because we know our inability to take personal responsibility?
I am so impressed, Hewat. In the first interview, I had given you a mission. Remember the mission that I gave you, Hewat. Look for the human.
Yeah.
You're looking for the human now, because the human is also absent in our own Ethiopian communities.
Yeah.
Where divorces are becoming fashionable, Hewat.
Mm-hmm.
And the lives of Black boys in particular, born to these divorce contexts, as you were contending, are menacing. So instead of learning virtues, we are learning vices in the name of autonomy. Look at how we are distorting the meaning of autonomy, the meaning of freedom, and breaking our families and subjecting our children to be raised in families, illiterate families, where the mother is hunting down and living at 2-3 different places, and the children are at home, roaming and not knowing where to go, what to read, in contrast to the attention, the vigilance, the love that it is going to care, to literally monitor the activities of your own child every day. This was a privilege that was systematically denied to Blacks, a situation which was attended to brilliantly during the period of Reconstruction, when the whites discovered that Blacks could do this and rolled it back. Then they began subjecting them to the reality that you were describing so intelligently, the broken families.
For those of you that are just joining us, we're having a conversation with Professor Teodros. We'll take a quick break now, but before we do, I have a few more questions for the professor, but I know you guys want to ask him some questions as well. So if you have some questions, please drop them for us, and I'll pick a couple of them, and we'll ask him and have him answer that for you as well. But we'll be right back after a quick break.
Adebabay Media Yanina. Adebabay Media Yanina. Adebabay Media Yanina. Adebabay Media የሁላችንም ነው። የኛ ቤተሰብ አደባባይ ሚዲያን ይመለከታል። የእናንተስ? Do your parents watch Adebabay Media? Watch, follow, subscribe and help አደባባይ። አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ
በዲያስፖራ ኢትዮጵያን ባለሙያዎች የተመሰረተ በጣም ፈጣን ቀላልና ደህንነቱን የጠበቀ ዓለም አቀፍ የሞባይል ካርድ መሙያ ድርጅቱ በአሁኑ ሰዓት ከኢትዮጵያ ጋር 10 የአፍሪካ ሀገራትን ትኩረት አድርጎ እየሰራ ሲሆን በመላው ኢትዮጵያ ለወዳጅ ዘመዶቻችን የሞባይል ካርድ በቀላሉ የምንሞላበት ዘዴ ነው። ፈጣን ቶፕ አፕ አደባባይ ሚዲያን እንኳን ለአንደኛ ዓመት በዓላችሁ አደረሳችሁ ያለ ስራችንንም ለመደገፍ በአደባባይ ሚዲያ በኩል ሞባይል ካርድ ለሚሞላ ከሽያጩ 7% ለአደባባይ ስራ መደገፊያ እንዲውል ያደርጋል። ለዚህም አደባባይ ሚዲያ የራሱን ማስፈንጠሪያ ተሰጥቶታል። www.ፈጣንቶፕአፕ.com/#አደባባይ በሚለው ለቤተሰብና ጓደኛ ካርድ ሲሞሉ አደባባይ ሚዲያን እየደገፉ ነው። እስከ የካቲት 21 ቀን የሚቆየውን የኢትዮ ቴሌኮም 50% ልዩ ጭማሪም ተጠቃሚ ይሆናሉ። ለምሳሌ ለወዳጆ የ200 ብር ካርድ ሲሞሉ ወዳጆ 300 ብር ሆኖ ይሞላላችኋል። የአደባባይ ሚዲያ ፈጣን ቶፕ አፕ ማስፈንጠሪያን በመጠቀም ሀገር ቤት ላሉ ወዳጅ ዘመዶቹ ካርድ ሲሞሉ አደባባይ ሚዲያን እየደገፉ ስለሆነ እናመሰግናለን። ፈጣን ቶፕ አፕ አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
Welcome back again. We're having a conversation with Professor Teodros today. And like I said before we went on a break, if you guys have a question that you want to ask the professor, you could go ahead and drop it in the chat box for us, and we'll pick up a couple of them just so that you guys are also engaged in asking the questions that you want to. Professor, to go back to, the map principle that you bring up, there was one thing that you brought up I found quite interesting. And so you say all human beings must be allowed to exercise their liberty and freedom without constraints and with self-imposed limitations. And this made me think, can people be trusted to self-impose limitations on themselves?
That is, in fact,
I think your light is a bit, I can't see you.
Okay. My computer ran out of battery, that's why I had. How about now? Oh. Okay?
Okay, it's okay. It's doable.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it's not as...
Yeah? Okay. How about now?
There you go. That's better.
All right. Okay. That is a question that I am struggling with at the moment. When I first developed this thesis about 20 years ago, it was when I was at my most idealist phase, in which I used to think that all human beings are equal, and in that if they are given the minimum requisite time during which they could learn how to choose for themselves, they could be trusted to make appropriate choices on their own. How little did I know as I began thinking through this question that one, that individuals are very different. They have different life histories. They come from different backgrounds. They have faced different challenges. And in that, the sense in which they could determine their destinies and make choices that are appropriately intelligent is really determined by these degrees and varieties of experiences over which they have no control. And in that, I could not leave it entirely up to the individual to make correct choices at all times. Under ideal conditions, of course, that is what should happen, and that is what could happen. But there are situations related, for example, to what I and you call this internalization of white supremacy that is particularly affecting blacks to be unkind to one another, cannot possibly presuppose the possibility that these blacks who are living in these decapitated neighborhoods and infesting their bodies by drugs and other material that they shouldn't, cannot possibly be trusted to make the right choices. And so, first, as you were contending earlier, we have to make absolutely certain, to the extent that we could, that families remain together, for example, that children are raised in households in which parents make determined efforts to be present for them, which of course is also related to the pressures and impossibilities that capitalism imposes on us sometimes, by which I mean there are parents who must work at 2-3 different places to make a living, you see. That's why the recent surge in this country to at least maximize wages to a reasonable degree is going to contribute to make it possible for parents to have one decent job so that they could be at home to attend to the cultivation and raising their children. And of course, if this is done well, and if it's done with remarkable consistency, then the argument that human beings should be entitled to basic rights and liberties that they themselves could determine becomes, I think, more compelling than otherwise.
I'll have to think about that for a bit, for sure. We have a question from our guest. I think this will tie really nicely. The teaching of Marcus Garvey is the solution, our viewers say. And he asked that if you could please share a bit about Marcus Garvey with us.
Well, Marcus Garvey was an advocate, the first advocate of what we now popularly call mental emancipation from slavery of all kinds, which is a point that Bob Marley also made part and parcel of his perennial songs, by which they both meant that something like tracing the history of blacks to Egypt, for example, and knowing this history and owning it gives the individual, I think, a sense of where that person came from. Yeah. The remarkable damage that has been done to black people is that we have no history. And I spent about an hour and a half making a case for Egypt, for example, precisely because what Marcus Garvey, Bob Marley, and all advocates of emancipation and from slavery have been hungering for, that we have a history, and once we know this history, then the flaws and imperfections that characterize our life, which are consequences of being told that you have no history, become self-correcting. So emancipation then, I think, begins with the project of knowing your history and also taking pride in the fact that you have a history. Remember Diop. Diop did not say that blacks should be very proud because they originated humankind. He simply said, no, human beings originated in Egypt, which did not necessarily lead to discussions of inferiority and superiority. This is the project, the project of 19th century racism, which insists on what I call valorizing, valuing human beings in correspondence to their skin colors and their cultural roots. While emancipation from slavery simply demands that we know where we came from, so that we can also think in terms of where we should be going. I think Marcus Garvey was an advocate of this mood, an advocate of this temperament, one of the best. And then Bob Marley carried it further. The great American sociologist, Du Bois, also carried this further. Then the psychologist, Frantz Fanon, also carried it further. All of them had a singular mission that they imposed themselves to help blacks retrieve their tradition, retrieve their roots, retrieve their wholeness, know who they are, so that they could work on who they would like to be.
Absolutely. I think the 19th century, the 20th century has given us a lot of Black intellectuals that I think people would be quite interested in finding out. But definitely starting with Marcus Garvey, Du Bois for sure, even Booker T. Washington in that list. They've done such a great job at really understanding what the terms, you know, emancipate yourself means, right? Not necessarily always waiting for the oppressor to do the right thing, but taking that onto yourself and going ahead and getting out of the victim mindset. We have another question from Cassis Nehemiah Getu. He's one of our own. Ethnic issues connect intimately with economic issues. I'm eager to hear what your input on this is. Sorry, let me repeat that. Ethical issues connect intimately with economic issues. I'm eager to hear what your input on this is.
Ethical issues with economic. This is a variant, I think, of the way I and you were trying to relate the moral virtues such as generosity, compassion, kindness, so forth and so on, to economic systems that either encourage them, generate them, and economic systems that suppress them. Economic systems that conceive of the human as selfish and greed, I think minimize the prospects of the human being to maximally work on being kind, being compassionate, being empathetic, versus an economic system that simply says the human is selfish and greed, which takes away the moral agency from the human being who has more to share with those who have nothing. Remember that particular example that I gave about that woman in the car to which many children's hands were moving in and yearning for attention, yearning for crumbs. And then instead of attending to them, I contended she couldn't even wait until the green light came on so that she could run away from them. If she was morally engaged, if she was morally attentive, she should have shared, obviously, what she could have possibly shared with them, because the fact that she was driving a BMW and probably coming from a very wealthy neighborhood indicates to me symbolically this is a human being who could have exercised her moral powers considerably more than she did, but given perhaps a perspective about which I do not know, that life is short, nasty and brutish, and in that each lives for him, for herself, does not commit her to extend herself to others, but it commits her to simply neglect them and even make herself richer. In this sense, I think the ethical decisions that we make and the economic institutions in which we live have a causal connection. The kinder, the more generous, the most justice-oriented the institutions are, the higher the possibility of individuals who live within them, who inhabit these institutions, to also accordingly behave and act generously, kindly, tolerantly, and respectfully.
Thank you. That ties what we've been talking about pretty well. We have another one from Dawit. He said, Kant famously said Africans cannot philosophize. Could you please talk about what philosophy would mean in the intellectual traditions of ancient Egypt and Ethiopia?
Well, the first portrait of the philosopher was given to us about 2,500 years ago in ancient Egypt, in which the philosopher sits, looks up in the sky, and is described as someone who is thinking deeply as he is unraveling the complications of life, because life is indeed complex, is working on himself to activate these moral possibilities that he has, is a great reader of texts, is humble, is well versed in history, is willing to help others, and also does not hesitate to ask help from them. This image of the philosopher was given to us about 2,500 years ago. And the word philosophy itself, which is a combination of the words philosoph and philosophy, philosoph and Sophia, the combination of which results in a rough translation of philosophy, meaning wisdom. A famous Congolese philosopher by the name of Obinga has argued, does not have any etymological roots in Greek. Its etymological roots are in an ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic, a term called sabayit, which means the one who is instructing, or the one who likes to get instructed. And in that, since wisdom itself is a consequence of internalizing instructions that are born out of experience, born out of a struggle, in this sense, the instructions that are inherent in the word sabai are also instructions to a degree that seem to be present in the concept of wisdom. And in that, the term philosophy, should it be given any etymological roots, has these etymological roots only in Egyptian hieroglyphics. And in this sense then, Plato, Aristotle, and Herodotus, the historian, all of whom have spent quite a number of years in ancient Egypt. We're told, for example, that Thales, I think, spent about 40 years. Pythagoras, the founder of mathematics, spent about 25 years. Plato and Aristotle were the frequent travelers to Egypt, all of whom pay humbly homage to ancient Egypt, from which they say they learned how to philosophize. In the way that that portrait of the philosopher that was given to us about 2,500 years ago, in which the philosopher is reflecting, in which the philosopher is developing moderate habits, in which the philosopher is investing time on studying and learning, in which the philosopher is instructing himself and readily asking instruction from those who know. All these virtues that gave rise to the idea of philosophy, this humble Greek philosophers contended were what they learned in ancient Egypt. Since philosophy, as I argued much earlier, grew out of opulence, out of comfort, out of wealth, out of leisure. And leisure, opulence, and time the ancient Egyptians had in ample time, which made it possible for them to philosophize.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. I've learned quite a lot. Just to wrap this up, I know last time we had this conversation, the assignment you gave us was, to find the human, to look for the human. Is there anything that you want us to take as homework, especially in, how do we begin to practice our moral thinking in that idea?
Okay. Let me put this as humbly as I can. Because I'm not there myself, but I would like to be there one day before I die. Mm-hmm. Every day, every single day, if you can, try to take some time and reflect on what you have done during that day. Practice that. Try to recall your interactions with other human beings. Even your phone conversations, even your email correspondences, and ask the question, have I been sufficiently kind, sufficiently attentive, sufficiently humble, sufficiently wise, sufficiently learned, sufficiently willing to improve my life? Visit your life every single day and measure it by the yardstick of my act. I mean it. Every day. You don't have to live in a fancy home to do this. You could be living in one room with 10 people and still manage to create a space of solitude. And just lose yourself in thoughts. Try that. Every day, though. I do this every single day. And I'm beginning to see my life changing. Because what I'm doing is, I'm looking both for the human that is absent and for the human in me, so that I could be the best human being that I could be. I don't think the counselors are serving us well when they tell us that we are greedy and selfish. I really don't think we are. We could become greedy and selfish if, as I contended much earlier, about 2 hours ago, we reduce ourselves to bodies.
Yeah.
That is when we can justify selfishness and greed. But if we think that we have souls, and if we engage our hearts, which are the set of thinking, and do so by taking a critical look at what we do, these at this particular time, for example, in Ethiopian history is crucial, because we are on the verge of destroying one another in Ethiopia. The time has come for us now not to listen to our leaders, because we have no leaders. These are leaders without mind, which is the ancient Egyptian problematic. So what are we left with now? Us, we individual Ethiopians, who should make determined effort not to hate human beings. And if we catch ourselves hating them, to weep internally and say to ourselves, I need to do more work. I cannot think of a better time than this time for us Ethiopians to engage in self-searching, because we have lost that human in us. Just visit the websites. Visit them. Look at what is being preached. Venom, hate, narrow-mindedness, provinciality, not love. Love is a power that we can develop if we make determined decisions to learn how to love. As a great Bohemian Austrian poet by the name of Rilke said, the most difficult thing that human beings are imposed on, he said, is love. Love is not lust. Love is not chemistry, ladies and gentlemen. There isn't such a thing called chemistry. Love is a project. First, one chooses to love. Second, one learns how to love. To the grave. To the casket. As a moral project. As an exercise in the development of moral economy. So I appeal to you, my Ethiopian brothers and sisters, to reflect on our miserable condition and do not let our leaders determine our destinies. Our destinies must be determined by the individual decisions that we make to love our Ethiopian brothers and sisters as much as we love our very selves. And I would like to say thank you to Hiwot Salamout for inviting me for the second time to share with you a few things that I've learned, having lived a long life. Thank you so much.
ቃለ ሕይወት ያሰማልን. I don't have the relative English term to say so, but ቃለ ሕይወት ያሰማልን I think is just the perfect word for the lessons that you're giving us, to be honest. And we try to share as much as we can about what our viewers are really appreciating and thankful that we're open and willing to have this conversation and for you to come and be able to share this with us as well. But before I say goodbye to you, could you tell us about the book that you just had out, so where we can find it, what it's about, and we'll share that as well.
Thank you so much. My most recent book is a book which is a compilation of conversations that I had with my good friend Cornel West in my own television program called African Ascent, which in turn became transcribed as a consequence of a request that my brilliant colleague and friend, childhood friend and publisher, Kasahun Chakola made, the owner and publisher of Africa World Press. The product, because of his conceptual vision, he's an incredible publisher, is this small book that is right in front of you, which functions like a handbook, which you can put in your pockets and read in about half an hour or so. And it's full of wisdom, the wisdom of the orator, the thinker, and the great writer, Cornel West, who is the leading African-American philosopher, in fact, one of the leading philosophers in the world today. And so please, if you have time, buy this particular book. And I would also like you to know that very soon, the young Hiwot, my interlocutor, my interviewer, whom I hope will be a long-time friend, will be published along with me. We're going to transcribe these two interviews in the form of a book. And my publisher, Kasahun Chakole, would be honored to publish them. So Hiwot and I will publish a book together.
See, I'm just hearing about this today as well, so I'm quite looking forward to it. And thank you for having that done I don't quite have the words yet, so I'll stick with thank you. And for all our viewers that have been following us today, of course, we'll have him back. That's been the question today. And we'll have another topic we'll talk to him about. And there's so much wisdom that we can learn from Dr. Teodros, as we've seen with two sessions now, and that's just not enough. So we'll have him back on a different topic. And thank you so much for everyone that attended. Please go ahead and share this conversation with people so we can learn together and grow together and really practice, maths or practice that love every day, and know that a leader that doesn't teach us about love, a leader doesn't teach us about compassion and tolerance is not really a leader. So for us to just take that moment, like he said, every day, practice it. And I personally have taken that. Maybe I'll take 10 minutes a day to do absolutely nothing but to just sit and really reflect on my day and the person I want to become. I hope you take that challenge along with me. And until next time, thank you so much again, Professor Teodros, and everyone else. We'll see you next week.
Yeah. And finally, I would like to thank Salamawit, whom I only met once as a great technician. Look at the visual presence of the two of us, which is a consequence of her skills and talents. And I would like to thank her. And I want to thank the Adebabay family for really giving me the honor, because he could have chosen so many much more competent, much abler than me, but yet you were kind enough to invite me 2 times, and I hope my mistakes are going to be lessened as I mature and grow when I come back and talk to you more. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful
Adebabay Media ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብሎ የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና ዕውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎ ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን adebabayinfomedia@gmail.com በዌብሳይታችን www.adebabay.com ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ
Adebabay media yene now. Adebabay media yenem now. Adebabay media yene now. Adebabay media የሁላችንም ነው። የኛ ቤተሰብ አደባባይ ሚዲያን ይመለከታል። የእናንተስ? Do your parents watch Adebabay media? Watch, follow, subscribe and help Adebabay. Adebabay media ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ